and today's tutorial is all about bread making. So you're going to be shown a demonstration on the really important process of kneading bread dough, and hopefully you'll then be able to use that and apply that knowledge to create your own bread using the recipe provided. So looking at the bread recipe, you'll notice that there is an ingredient labelled yeast. Now yeast is really important when making bread. It's a vital ingredient to enable you to create a nice, well-risen loaf of bread. Basically, yeast is an agent that acts as a leavener, so it helps to create gases, and that effectively is what creates the bubbles and helps the bread to rise once it's cooking. If you've had problems with making bread before, or even when you complete this task and your bread doesn't rise, the first thing I'd ask you to look at is your yeast. Now, yeast can be active or inactive, and it does go out of date. So if your bread hasn't risen and you can't see any other reason why it's not gone right, check the best before date of your yeast, because it may be that it's expired and it's no longer active. So when you're kneading the bread, you're using your hands. It's a very physical task, and you need to use the palm of your hand mostly. If you watch what I'm doing here, I'm literally just stretching the bread away from me using the heel of my hand and then pull it back in on itself. You may need to put some flour down on your work surface before you start doing this. Obviously this depends on how wet your dough mixture is to begin with. Now periodically you're going to see that I keep adding a little bit more flour to my dough mix. I wasn't very happy with its texture. It was a little bit too moist and too sticky for my liking. What I would recommend is, if you're in a similar position, don't make the mistake of adding lots of flour in one go. You're better to do it little by little. All that will happen if you add too much flour is that you end up with a dry mixture and then need to make it more moist. There isn't really a shortcut for this step of the recipe unless you're using a bread maker. So this is a time-consuming part of the recipe. I would say at least 10 minutes needs to be spent kneading the bread like this. It is a physical task. Your arms might start to ache after a while. That's normal. Now the reason that we have to do this when making bread is this kneading process stretches the gluten and is what helps to make the bread fluffy and gives it its texture. So if you don't spend enough time kneading the bread, then you're going to end up with quite a flat loaf that's more biscuit-like. The texture that you're aiming for is a really silky, smooth texture to your bread dough. So how can we improve the flavour of bread? So the flavour of bread is pretty box standard. You'll have your white loaves and you'll have your wholemeal, and you might have your best of both, or your granary. Now granary breads is when we start using seeds and nuts, and that will alter the flavour, also improve the texture and the nutritional content of the bread. So those are 3 reasons why we might play around and experiment with other ingredients in our bread, but we can be much more creative than that. When I cook bread, I tend to explore and experiment with flavours that I really like. So for example, slicing up green olives or sun-dried tomatoes. There are lots of different ingredients you could put into bread. We can even make sweetbreads as well. It's really important that you think about what those ingredients are going to do to the dough when you're making the bread. So for example, if you're using more wet ingredients, you're going to end up with a wetter bread dough. So it's important to perhaps minimise the amount of fluid that you're putting in with extra additional ingredients, or perhaps compensate for that with your recipe by adding a little bit more flour to balance it out. The other way that we can adapt and develop your bread recipe is thinking about the presentation of it. Now obviously I mean as well when we're presenting on a plate with some garnish or some accompaniment to make it look more than just a slice of bread. But before that stage, even the way you shape your dough could be really creative. If you look on our Pinterest page or online, you'll see some really good ideas and intricate ideas for shaping the bread. So for example, plaiting the bread or even shaping it to look like an animal. If you're just starting out with something like this, a hedgehog is quite a simple one to do, using a pair of scissors to cut into the dough to create the spikes. One thing I will say is that when you're shaping your bread, it's before the proving stage, and therefore your shape may change slightly as your bread grows. So don't be too disappointed if it doesn't turn out exactly as you like, but I would recommend you having a go and experimenting with a really creative way of shaping your bread before you bake it. So this is my bread dough an hour later. You can see that it has grown, it has doubled in size in that time. You'll need to turn it out onto the floured surface again, and this next step is called knocking it back. So you're punching the air out to begin with, before turning the bread back in on itself. And this is the stage where you want to shape your bread. If you haven't already, you'll want to add in your other ingredients at this point too. Now, I would recommend dividing your dough up into 4 different loaves and shaping them in different ways. If you wanted to do this really accurately, you could weigh out the mixture so that you know that you have 4 equal parts. Now, this first one I'm showing you is just your standard roll shape. So I'm just smoothing and folding the bread dough under itself to create a nice round roll. And then I'm just going to score across into the top of the bread. This next one is braiding the bread, which probably isn't as easy as it sounds. Braiding bread dough is not that simple. So you start off with 3 strands. You need to divide one of your balls into 3 strands, try and make them equal thickness and length, and then braid them together. This next one's going to be my attempt at a hedgehog, so I'm going to create a shape so that it's almost got a point at one end, which will be the nose, and then you'll need a pair of scissors to create the spikes. So you just literally pinch the dough and cut to create the spikes. Now what you might want to do is add on other ingredients after you've baked your bread to create features like eyes and nose. You could use things like olives or raisins even. It's really important after you've shaped your bread dough and placed them on the baking trays not to touch them again at all until they've gone into the oven. Touching them again could end up in you knocking the air out inadvertently and ending up with flat loaves.